Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. You've joined our PSAC BC Lunch and Learn on why is affordable, accessible, and publicly funded childcare central to Canada's pandemic recovery. We have a variety of folks with us today, and I'd like to first introduce Karen Sutton, our PSAC BC Women's Regional Coordinator, who will open up for us today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Monica. Sikon Youngyets. Hello, my name is Karen Sutton. I am the BC Women's Coordinator and a proud Mohawk woman. I would like to take this opportunity for us all to reflect on our relationships with the people and the land in which we sit on. Do you take time to gain information about the language of these people? Have you researched what natural medicines the land provides? Have you shown gratitude to the people or land? Have you done your part to give back and learn their ways? If not, I invite you to do so. I come to you today from where I humbly work and play on the stolen lands of the Tsleil Nation, and I now ask that Monica share with us what stolen lands she sits on and honors here today.
Thanks, Karen. So my name is Monical Urrutia, and I'm with the PSAC. I'm one of our regional reps that work out of our Vancouver office. The shared territories that I'm on that are unceded and unsurrendered are the Stolo, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. And I really liked some of those opening questions that Karen had, because I think that one of them that I'd like to commit to taking on is some of the more the natural resources that are around, because there's so many parks and beautiful grasses and things like that in Burnaby that I'd love to know a little bit more about what are some of the ones that are indigenous to these lands. So thanks for that, Karen. So for our discussion today, I'm really happy to be able to introduce to you two of our main folks who will talk to you over the next little while. We have Sharon Gregson joining us from the Coalition of Childcare Advocates in BC. Hi, Sharon, and thanks for joining again. And we've also asked Nielene Chand, who is our West Fraser Valley president of our area council there, and also the third alternate to women's coordinator, so third alternate to Karen, to share some of her experiences as well. We also want to acknowledge the folks that we have in the room, all of you, of course, and that we also have my colleague Patrick Bragg helping us with our back end as always, which we always appreciate, especially in terms of these technological times that we're in. So maybe to kick it off, we'd like to first throw out a poll and get some engagement from you folks who've joined us. And you know, this has been a series of panels that we've been doing. This is our last one. For those of you who maybe joined all along the way, you know that we began the first one with talking about how why should women be at the forefront of the pandemic recovery. There is one on just recovery in general, where we had folks talking about that with the CCPA. And now we're bookending it at the end here with talking about how childcare should be central to this recovery. So one of the things that we wanted to ask in terms of childcare then, if we could launch the poll. Has access to childcare during the pandemic affected you or someone close to you? So the answers that you could choose, it's multiple choice. You can choose all that apply. Are my childcare needs were affected? Someone close to me had their childcare needs affected? Childcare needs do not affect me or someone close to me? No, but I provide childcare and that was affected, or unsure, don't know. So for those of you who are with us, feel free to mark your choices. I always like to wonder if I should make some kind of those Jeopardy music, but I'll leave it to Patrick to decide when he wants to reveal the poll, because I don't see it from my end, but I'll see it just like you. I'll be surprised to see what the answers are at the end. Excellent. So for those of you who replied, 13% of you were saying that your own child needs were affected during this pandemic. There was a tie of 38% for both. For someone close to you, had your child care needs affected, or you did not affect you or someone close to you. And then one was, or 13% was unsure or don't know. So thanks for letting us know that. I think it'll help when we start talking with Sharon and Nielene to know kind of some of the impacts that this pandemic has had in terms of childcare for those of you who are participating today. So why don't we start with some of that experience? Let's pivot over to Nielene and say, for yourself, how has your childcare been affected by this pandemic, Nielene?
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for the invitation to this very important discussion. I would like to first off also like to acknowledge that I'm in Langley, BC, which is the unceded Indigenous lands belonging to the Coast Salish peoples, which includes the territories of Tsawwassen, First Nations, Stolo, and Kwalin. So for myself, a little background, I have 3 children. So currently I have a 17-year-old graduating this year. Yay! I have a 14-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old son. So when the pandemic hit, it really affected my youngest because he was in before and after school care. And definitely, when all the schools closed down, that affected everybody, whether they had childcare needs or not. But when the schools closed down, the childcare is closed down as well. I was very fortunate that the childcare, the before and after school care that my son attends is connected to the school. And it is a licensed childcare. And it was a great childcare because it transitioned. He was there full time, and then he went to before and after school care. Unfortunately, with having all 3 of them at home, it affected my work because I'm very fortunate that my employer allowed me to continue to work at home, but just the focus on my work got affected. My mental health, having 3 kids at home, my mental health was surely affected. And even when the schools returned, the childcare that my son was in, they had to make a very difficult decision because they were limited with the amount of kids that they could have. So that they made the decision that they would only take full-time care. So I no longer had that option when schools returned in September to put him before and after school care. So me and my husband really had to make a difficult decision whether to find another before and after school care or find a way that we can manage our work and our life and see if we can do that. So we did make the difficult decision not to continue, not to find another one. But I'll tell you, I searched and there was no before and after school care available once the school started. So that made our decision much easier not to re-enroll him, because even with my minimal search or the extensive search, there was nothing available. So here we are now, and I just think to myself, even with him not in before and after school care, it's still a struggle with me working when he is at home. And I would probably be even more productive if he was in before and after school care, even just for that small period of time. So that's kind of my background on my childcare experience since the pandemic.
Thanks for that, Nielene. Yeah, I think that before I pivot over to Sharon, one of the things that we wanted to also highlight from Nielene's personal experience to the larger PSAC BC membership was that last year, we actually conducted for the women's committees conducted a COVID-19 and women's survey. And one of the questions was around the impacts of childcare. This was a survey that was initiated by Karen's predecessor, Kelly Sidhu, and she really worked with her women leaders in terms of getting this out there. And it kind of captured a snapshot of where our women, what they were experiencing about 6 months after the pandemic had started, just to say. And I wanted to say specifically that for the women who identified that childcare was an issue for them, 70% of them said that they had an increased impact in terms of childcare. And I wanted to also share just a couple of the quotes that they talked about, especially when if they were working from home, as like Nielene's experience was, and then some of the dilemmas that they would have. So one quote was, for example, when they had to go grocery shopping. So one of our women anonymously submitted, "At first, I left my kids in the car alone while I waited in line and grocery shopped. It was very stressful and scary, and I've never done that before. I had to get a second cell phone, it was felt safer than leaving them home alone. I share that because of that kind of dilemma. What do you do when your kids are at home? There was no school, they had no care, that kind of a thing. And also about what Nielen's point about availability. There is also another comment here is we have lost both of our childcare centers. One is closed permanently and the other is closed indefinitely due to COVID. There is no other childcare options around us for now. So those are some of our PSAC BC members. And so kind of like going to Sharon on a bigger picture for BC, what have you heard about childcare impacts, both from people who need childcare and from the providers?
Right. So BC is a little bit different than the rest of the country because the provincial government here provided financial incentives to organizations to keep them afloat. So that meant that parents could not use their space when COVID was at its height originally, and they wouldn't lose their spot. That the center received money to hold it for them. And that in some cases, it was quite a lot of money. So if you stayed open, you got 7 times your regular provincial funding. And if you closed, you got 2 times your funding. So while across a lot of the country, particularly in Ontario, a lot of programs closed, in BC, most have remained afloat. Now, that's not to say that some haven't closed, particularly for-profit businesses have closed. The not-for-profits tend to be more stable. And of course, the publicly operated ones are the most stable. But clearly, there's an ongoing impact. There's still reduced enrollment. A lot of parents are still reluctant to enroll their children, or the parents have lost their jobs and so they don't need childcare anymore. So enrollment is low in a number of programs, particularly in school age programs. And there's the issue around staffing, early childhood educators, school age childcare providers. Those mostly women and often racialized women are under an incredible amount of stress. They are working with unvaccinated populations. They're working with children who don't understand social distancing and don't wear masks. So a huge amount of stress on the caregivers, the educators, the professionals in the sector. So it is, childcare was already stressed before the pandemic. The pandemic has really shone a light on childcare as the workforce behind the workforce, and how fragile our childcare system is in BC and in fact across most of the country.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that when we're looking at this question as we move towards why we're gonna look at childcare as part of, or central as part of a pandemic recovery. That's one of the things that's not only needs and the changing needs, but also what are we going to be looking at for the long term, right? So it's interesting because in our survey that we conducted for those who aren't as familiar with our COVID-19 and women survey, actually the majority of our respondents didn't have childcare needs. But one of the things that we said there is that it's also important to look at the data of those who did identify that they did have childcare needs, because then they show their impacts. And so what would you normally say in terms of for folks who don't have childcare needs, why should this be an important issue to them?
Oh, that's such an easy question to answer. So you might not have children, young children, but I'll bet when you go to the emergency room and you need health care, that some of the nurses and doctors do need childcare in order to go to work and then provide you with health care. When you go to the grocery store and you're in the lineup, I bet you that the person working in the cashier or stocking shelves, or the person who drove the truck to get your groceries to your grocery store, I bet some of them depend on childcare. There's a really humorous, tongue-in-cheek little vignette called "A Day Without Childcare in Humboldt County." If you Google it, you'll find it. And it is what happens when childcare stops operating in a town. The journalists can't go to work. The grocery store people can't go to work. The nurses don't go to work. The people who are digging holes in the street don't go to work. Our society kind of collapses because childcare is the support of the workforce behind the workforce. So you might not have kids yourself, but I bet you 100% that you depend on somebody who does depend on childcare to go to work and provide you with goods and services.
How about you, Nielene? From an individual point of view, as a worker, what do you think? How would you also answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think of my situation and when I said, when the school system shut down, when the childcare shut down, my employer did give me the opportunity to work from home, but I wasn't as productive. Like it's, I have the tools at home, but I have to watch my kids as well. And even so, if I'm not as productive, the other individuals are not getting in my workplace are not getting the support that I would have and would need to pick up where I'm missing. And it affects me mentally and it affects me. And if it's affecting me, it'll affect my work and it'll affect the other individuals in the workplace. So I can see how it trickles down even to the individuals that aren't having childcare needs. They may have to do additional work because I'm not available. And so that will affect them.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that unfortunately, the pandemic helped to bring to light was really some of that invisible work that we see. And we talked a little bit about this in our women's panel, but it still comes to the forefront where, as Sharon said, it might have been a tongue-in-cheek vignette, but we actually lived through that from the beginning of 2020 when it was all of a sudden everything was quiet, no cars on the road, nobody could go anywhere, and so now what happens, right? And that's the thing. And so I might come back to you, Sharon, to say a bit more like, how would you, our main question here is we're saying that childcare really is central to economic recovery. And that's different from just saying it's a good thing or it's a nice add-on. So what are some of those kind of concrete benefits, like for those who are more like about the data or the economics behind it or the money? Like what is that?
Mm-hmm. Well, you're quite right that childcare just being the right thing to do to support children and families has not been a winning argument. We've had to actually cost out the $10 a day childcare plan with our colleagues at UBC in order to prove several times, in fact, with different economists, prove that investment in a quality, affordable childcare system like the 10 a day plan that we're recommending in BC actually pays for itself, not just in the long term, not just 25 years from now when those babies that go to a childcare program graduate from university, but actually in the short to medium term. And we know that so many women have lost their employment who are in the service industries. We know that there's a massive labor shortage. You just have to drive anywhere and see help wanted signs. We need childcare in order to really facilitate mothers being able, and fathers, but primarily mothers are impacted by this issue, to participate in the workforce. So there is an immediate benefit for our economy when more people are able to go to work. And what do we do when we go to work? We pay income taxes. We spend our paychecks in our local economy. Childcare enables that. It's like an economic engine. And the data from Quebec, where they've had affordable childcare since the late 90s, the analysis there is that for every dollar that government has invested into the Quebec childcare system, there's $1.75 returned. So investing in childcare in Quebec has not required an increase in taxes. It has paid for itself. And that is when we look at jurisdictions around the world that have quality, affordable childcare, that is what happens. It enables people to go to work. It allows single parents to move off social assistance because they can actually afford to go to work. And it enables children to be more ready to be successful when they start school. So there's less remedial work that has to be done once children, have special needs that are recognized perhaps in grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3. They can be remedied and start to act upon in the early years. So it's, not to mention the economic piece, it's about gender equity, it's about children's healthy development. It's just the right thing to do, and it's got an economic payback.
I like that. That's absolutely, I love that. The right thing to do. And in case you need something more, and apparently, obviously, over the years, that has been needed. Let's launch our second poll because I'd love to see the answers for this from our participants. Is childcare among your top 3 priority issues you're considering in terms of how you will vote in the federal election? You can only select one answer here. Yes, no, unsure, or still need more information. So once we see those answers are in from the majority of folks, then we can reveal to all the responses.
And maybe, Monica, if I can jump in here, this is an election that there are some very important issues. Not that every election doesn't have important issues, but it does seem that for my organization, as we're talking with our colleagues, you know, our province is on fire, there's major flooding, we're worried about the severity of the immediacy of climate change, truth and reconciliation, you know, there's the cutting down of old growth, you know, there's so many super important life-changing issues in this election that we understand people have to grapple with a lot of those issues to cast their vote. But what we're adding into that discussion is to say, this is a pivotal moment for childcare. We have
Yes.
never been this close before on federal leadership on childcare. We've had the promises before. This time we've actually got some signed agreements. So there's a lot at stake for childcare in this election.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with that. So let's see what the what our folks have said in terms of responses. Yes, it's overwhelming. Yes, at 71%. Good to see that, and hope that you're also using your influence and abilities to get that vote spread wider amongst your circle. No for 14% and unsure for 14%. So hopefully we'll provide some information for you that will help get that unsure to consider it as one of your priorities. And just as Sharon said, in terms of it being so pivotal, let's talk a little bit about where the parties are at. I might start, if you wouldn't mind, with you, Sharon, and then we can comment and bring a little bit about where PSAC sees the parties, which I'm sure is probably fairly similar to where CCABC is at. Where are they at? Where are the parties at? What are they promising and not promising?
Right. So maybe I'll start by saying this is an election that certainly we were not wanting because childcare was finally on a trajectory where the federal government had signed bilateral agreements with 8 provinces and territories for, you know, the first time having a federal finance minister who was a woman, Chrystia Freeland, prioritizing childcare, commitment of $30 billion over 5 years from the federal government. We've never seen that kind of financial commitment, and we've never seen actually the signed agreements that are this detailed and really delivering on what the advocates, both provincially and nationally through Childcare Now, have been asking for. So it was really a celebration in July when these bilateral agreements were signed. The Liberals, of course, are promising that if re-elected, they will continue with the bilateral agreements. They just signed them. It's in their budget, their last budget. They say they will be held accountable to deliver. The NDP has said that they will honor those bilateral agreements. And that is really significant because the bilateral agreements are what the advocates have been calling for. So to get rid of them would not be helpful. So the NDP has, Jagmeet Singh has said he will uphold those agreements. And the Greens have not been very specific, but it sounds like they will uphold those agreements, but there's not very much detail. The Conservatives are the one that are promising something completely different. Very much along the lines of what the Harper years, promising to get rid of the bilateral agreements and instead provide a tax credit. So the tax credits have been tried in various provinces in small ways. They do nothing at all to lower parent fees. They do nothing at all to create new licensed spaces. And importantly, they do nothing at all for the ECE workforce. They don't do anything for wages or compensation. And when the numbers are actually crunched, and the economist David McDonald with the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, crunched the numbers, and the Conservatives are promising that they will refund up to 75% of parent fees. What they don't say is that it's a maximum of $6,000 a year, and only for people who make $30,000 a year or less. Well, if you make $30,000 a year or less, you're already getting subsidy from your provincial government and getting a lot of your fees covered. So in actual fact, only about, across the entire country, only about 6,600 families will benefit with that $6,000 in the Conservative plan. You know, we've got nearly 600,000 children 0 to 12 in our province, so a minuscule amount, almost a statistically insignificant amount of families would benefit. With the Liberal NDP plan, next year fees will be reduced by 50% by December, 50% on average. That's about $400 a month. And so savings would you know, range from $6,000 next year up to within 5 years, when they say 10 a day will be fully implemented, which will be a, you know, savings easily of $10,000 a year for families. So I know all too well, having been a childcare advocate since the late 80s, I have seen promises made provincially and federally, promises made, promises not kept. This time, these bilateral agreements are different in that they're delivering what the advocates have been asking for, and agreements have already been signed. Now, that's not to say that we won't have to hold politicians accountable, right? That we won't have to maintain our advocacy, maintain our loud voices to make it happen. But there is a big difference between what's on the table between 3 of the parties and the outlier.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sharon, because I think that you know, that national outlook is really important. And I know that for PSAC members, you kind of want to know also where your union is at. Well, you know, we have a lot of this information on our national website, but also just to share briefly that for many years, probably as long as Sharon has said, she's been doing advocacy for this issue. PSAC has also been in that forefront in fighting for childcare. And our primary premise really is the discussion that we're having in terms of that we want it to be affordable, accessible, and publicly funded. What PSAC's stand also talks about is that we are looking to support and hoping our members will support parties that look at things that reduce fees, create more spaces, help women return to work, because we also recognize that predominantly women are the ones who have been impacted when there is a lack of childcare. Not to say that there are not other genders that are impacted, but predominantly women. And that we also support the call for fair wages for early childhood educators. So in that vein, you know, we have an analysis of the 4 parties, very similar to what Sharon has presented. I also took a look at the particular parties, and even just kind of going through them at a glance. I also found it very interesting to go through all of the parties' platforms and see how they even write about childcare. And so I don't know if other people have picked up on this, but when you take a look at how it's even framed within their platforms, for example, within the Conservative Party's platform, they really only limit it to talking about it within how it impacts women and how it impacts working families. In the Green Party platform, for example, they have it as one sole portion of their platform. But what I found interesting about the Liberal Party and the NDP platforms is they mention childcare all throughout their platform and talk about it how it is integral. Coming back to this question about why it's central to the pandemic recovery, they talk about it all throughout. They talk about in terms of infrastructure, building child care centers, for example. They talk about it, yes, about workers, about fair wages. They talk about it about gender equity. So it's interesting to see, even in their own party platforms, when you take a look at their documents, how they even frame that issue. So I think that we're hoping that, you know, folks will take a look at some of that analysis that Sharon's coalition has provided, as well as the PSAC's party analysis that we have on our national website. So we do want to leave some time. We did promise that we would leave some time for folks in case you had particular comments that you wanted to share or questions that you wanted to share as well about how you feel childcare should be central to the pandemic recovery and really a main question in this federal election. So if there are folks who'd like to share, you could either put it into the chat and we could read it out and see if there's any comments there. Or if you want to raise your hand and you could raise your question yourself. I'll just pause for a sec to see if there's any questions that we had. For the folks that are watching this afterwards, because we are going to share our video afterwards, there's some things that we're sharing in the chat. If you go to www.10aday.ca, Sharon shared that in the chat for you. We'll also have a follow-up email to all of our participants that can provide some of that information.
I'm really curious for the people on the call, you know, what part of the province they're in and if they see childcare as being an issue in their community, even if it doesn't impact them personally.
Great question. For anybody who wants to answer that, feel free. Again, you can either put up your hand to unmute or put it into the chat.
Okay, sorry, it's Zita. I can't find my hands up, so sorry.
That's okay.
Anybody who knows me, I'm not very good at this. So, but I just wanted to make a comment. Like Nielene, I have a son who's graduating this year, and I only have one. But I have my sister has my niece is just in grade 2. But she shared with me the costs and stuff, and I honest to God don't know if I could have afforded. I mean, it was expensive, and I have no idea how we made it happen when he was younger, because he was in daycare right from the get-go. How that would even happen, how I could even afford it. But getting back to the other point is, I realize I don't have a daycare issue, but with the COVID and having your kid at home, I mean, reshuffling my schedule to go pick him up from school because he's not close, and I refuse to have him on a bus. There's just no way I was going to let him take a bus. He's an asthmatic. And then with him being in the house with me, even though he was upstairs in the afternoon, because, you know, doing his stuff, but it's like being very quiet because he's not used to that too. It was hard to manage, I guess. And I feel fortunate that I was able to have the employer that I could work at home, so I didn't have to worry about how he was going to get home from school, you know. But my whole, I had to start I'm starting a half an hour earlier than I normally do, just to compensate for that time to go and get him. But anyway, it doesn't affect just, you know, people who need childcare, people with children in the house at all, pretty much at any age, I'm guessing now. It is a huge thing, but my heart goes out to my sister. You know, she was just terrified about sending her daughter back to daycare because she had to go to work. She wasn't fortunate like me and didn't work for a company that gave her choices. She had to find a date, well, she did have daycare and they stayed open, but she was just terrified because as soon as they have a little sniffle, which we all know kids do, boom, you're off, go home. We don't want fear, right? We don't want you here.
Yeah.
It was very, very, very difficult and hard to manage your mental health. Like Nielene said, that was another fair point. But anyway, I'm done rambling now. Thanks guys for listening.
2 quick things to pick up from those comments. One is that another result of the pandemic that's impacted people's work is more precarious work. So more Amazon delivery people, more DoorDash delivery people, people who don't work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, who are working varied shifts, maybe on call, 12 days, 12 hours on, 3 days off, whatever. We need a childcare system that can respond to that new employment reality and be flexible to offer earlier starts, later evenings, more part-time care, more flexible childcare. That's the kind of system that we need. And tax credits are not going to create that. Your sister was scared about putting her child back in childcare. Imagine the childcare providers, how scared they are working with a large group of unvaccinated children, having the parents coming and going at the beginning and end of every day, having to set up COVID protocols to manage all that, and still only earning, $20 an hour if you're really lucky. So yeah, we have so much to do to actually fix the system. We need the province on board, John Horgan and the BC NDP, we need them on board, and we need new federal investment to really build the system that the families need, ultimately benefiting employers and all of us.
I see a hand from Karen.
Thanks, Monica. I live in the Okanagan, and we are very much, well, I live in wine country, so we're agriculture. And our, our neighbors don't have the ability to work 9 to 5 or, so when COVID came along and the daycares shut down and schools shut down, like parents are outside and they're out in the fields. And I don't know how many times I had driven down the road at night and literally saw our workers working with headlamps on, because that's when their partner would come home from work. And that's when they were having the ability to have their spouse watch their children and them get out to the fields. That's a dangerous situation. We've got bears, we've got coyotes, we have, working with heavy machinery, things like that. So I didn't realize, and I'm the first to admit it, I don't have children. I wasn't affected. But then I started seeing these things and started hearing about how my neighbors are affected. And I was astonished. So it's things like this and these types of discussions that I am very grateful for. So I'm thankful that PSAC actually allows these types of events so that we can educate even those who didn't think it affected me. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Karen. I did see another hand. Nielene, did you want to chime in there yet? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I liked Sharon's discussions about the different family types. And we have been talking about spouses, but also the single parents. Like I have a brother who has shared custody, and I see the struggles he faced. He mentioned if childcare was affordable, he can probably afford to put his son in childcare, even if he has him half of the time. So he has him a week on and a week off. And I don't know that many childcare options available for those types of family situations. And in his situation, he has to pick up his son, and he's very fortunate that his employer allows him to bring his son to work for that last period of time. And so I think about that and I'm like, how is it affecting his coworkers with him having his son there? How is it affecting his son having to go there, after school and having to sit and wait while his father finishes work? So there's so many different situations, and there needs to be more childcare options for all those types of situations.
Yes, exactly. Thanks, Nielene. And I think for sure the first and foremost thing is that we need to ensure that folks are hopefully making some political choices to ensure that universal childcare gets there, and then let's move on expanding on how it's actually getting applied, things like that for sure. One of the things that I wanted to just mention as we're wrapping up, unless there's other questions, feel free to put them in the chat or indicate with your hand, was that when we talked about the cost, when Zita mentioned about she can't imagine the cost, if Nielene was saying by kind of naming some of her ages of her children that might age her, does it mean that if I say I have an 8-year-old that I'm younger than I appear? So I have an 8-year-old, for example, and I recognize that I'm a very privileged worker, but when you combine my childcare fees, especially when I was first going back to work when my child was quite young, and my housing fees, it was like 50% of my income, right? And I'm a privileged worker. So can you imagine for those, I think I saw it in a different article where they were saying the average cost of childcare was about $1,600 in Vancouver. Sharon, you'd probably know this quote better or not. And then I did the math. Okay, fees in Vancouver have reached $2,600. So I definitely did the math on that. A minimum wage worker working full-time makes less than that. There is no way even someone on minimum wage let alone, you know, a privileged worker like myself. Like that's not going to be their reality, and that's not going to be affordability, right? So getting again, in terms of PSAC's position, for sure, getting a tax credit is not going to achieve a universal childcare, which is what PSAC's position is, for sure. And then there's another thing in the chat, just added the last fee I paid for just before and after school chair was $5.50 a month. And so this is, you have someone in school in the middle, but the $5.50 a month for yourself, Neil, and that was in licensed care, I understand, right? Yeah. I think it's also important to know how childcare changes over time when you talk about types. Because when I was thinking about getting ready for this work, this panel, that's the thing that I reflected on, is the childcare needs I had when I first had my child, and then going as you know, as people were saying, as they go into school, and then even older, because you think, oh, they're old enough, they can just care for themselves. But sometimes that's actually when you need more childcare or more adult supervision because of certain things that they could be making choices about as they grow older. So it's not something that is just, you know, a finite before they're 5 years old and then we're done. It's something that is really part of that evolution, which is why I truly believe it as also part of the education system, right? Like it's early childhood education all the way through, and not just before they go into the school system. So I'm just going to check what else is in the chat here. Things have been appearing that I don't want to make sure I don't miss sharing. So Sharon wanted to share with folks, childcare fees for infant toddlers are like paying rent or mortgage twice each month. Absolutely, absolutely. And another sharing here from Hetty. I remember under the Harper government, I got the childcare benefit, but it was only a drop in the bucket for what I had to pay for childcare. I hear that, and I can see when you look at the again, when you look at the platforms, they really mark out. They have even a chart in the conservative platform, for example, and it really shows you that when you're making a certain amount, this is the only amount that you're going to get. It's not, as Sharon said, in order to get that, even the 6,000 that they're talking about, your family income would have to be 30,000 or less. And I don't think that that's going to be a large portion of the country, which is why they're saying only a certain amount of families across the country would ever get that full tax advantage, quote unquote. So as we close down, I'd like to thank you all for participating and give Karen an opportunity to say our final words, and to our panelists as well. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks, Monica. I have learned so much today, and thank you for all of you actually sharing what you've shared. I'm astonished at what people pay for childcare, but I have to say that it's a great piece of education for all of us. And like I say, for especially for people that don't think that it affects them. And I realize now why there are so many people that you know, they struggle. And I now have even more information to share with people when they say, well, why aren't people getting off their butts and going to work? Why aren't they, you know, doing more? Well, because financially there's a barrier. And so I really want to take this opportunity to ask everyone to share on any of their social media the platforms that each political party is showing about childcare. When I realized that the tax breaks are going to affect as little amount of people as possible, I'm disgusted by it. And I'm encouraged that the three other parties are looking at the bilateral agreements. And again, I ask that everybody do their part to educate themselves and to educate others, because I have learned so much today, and we need to share that. We need to get that information out, because as I've learned, childcare affects everybody. So thank you, each one of you, for sharing your stories, sharing the information. For people that need extra resources, please feel free to go to the PSAC national websites, because there are information on links to the party records, as well as the gender equity task reports. There's a bunch of information there. So thank you very much again, Sharon and Nielene, for hosting today. It's greatly appreciated. And Monica and Patrick for doing your part, and everyone for attending. So
Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody.
Bye for now.
Don't forget 5 days until we vote. So go out there and vote.